Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. Today, we're pleased to have FARAH PANDITH, former and the very first U.S. Special Representative to Muslim communities, to help us understand America's relationship with the Muslim communities over the last 2 decades. FARAH served in both Bush and Obama administrations in various government agencies, including the White House National Security Council, U.S. Department of State, USAID, and Department of Homeland Security. She wrote a book, How We Win, that recounts her government experiences, and she's currently a fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center. Welcome, FARAH.
Thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be here with you. It's nice to see you.
So President Biden's most recent Middle East trip, especially the stop in Saudi Arabia and meeting with the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, led to serious debates in Washington, D.C. about U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia. And in your book, published in 2019, you said Saudi Arabia is the world's top exporter and enabler of Islamic extremism. Can you elaborate more on that point? And perhaps why the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia is so important, yet so complicated?
Let's start with it's so complicated. It is impossible to describe in a nutshell why Saudi Arabia is so important to the way in which we think about the Middle East and how we, over decades, have thought about the importance of the trust that we built with the kingdom, how we think about its resources, what we know to be true about the way in which they engage with other parts of the Middle East, and why it's important to us. What I say in the book is not about U.S. foreign policy to the Middle East. What I talk about in the chapter called Plague from the Gulf is the importance of understanding the system that is supporting extremism around the world. Where are the ideologies of us versus them taking root? How are they funded? How do they spread? Why is it important to understand the origin stories of how people think about themselves and their identity? Saudi Arabia, in the work that I did in government, to my surprise, because when I came into government, I had no idea that they had done so much around the world to shape the feeling of being Muslim around the world. And what I uncovered was, whether I was in Zanzibar or I was in Surabaya, whether I was in Malaysia, whether I was in Norway, didn't matter where in the world I was, that I saw evidence of Saudi Arabia funding and curtailing the way people think about their heritage, their diversity of being Muslims, how it feels to be Muslim. And that was important, because if you begin to see an identity crisis happening around the world with young Muslims under the age of 30 primarily, and you're asking yourself, where are they getting the notions about what a true Muslim is? Or where are they learning about their faith? Where are they learning about mutual respect for other kinds of religions and other kinds of people? And things keep coming back to a couple of sources: the training of religious leaders that come out of Saudi Arabia that go around the world, the spreading of a very particular translation of the Quran that they give for free around the world, including in the United States. You see the eradication of history in parts of the world, Bosnia, parts of Africa, where they're reshaping the heritage stories of traditional cultures. You begin to ask yourself, what's the impact of this? So the component that I talk about in the book had to do with the plank that supports the system underlying extremism, and that coming directly from Saudi Arabia. Now, put that aside for a moment. Our relationship with Saudi Arabia isn't only around that, but we have spent billions of dollars in fighting terrorist organizations that use an ideology of us versus them in places all over the world. Obviously, some of the most obvious are Afghanistan and Iraq, when we were fighting ISIS also in Syria. We saw the implication for American taxpayer dollars, for our troops, for the way in which we are, thinking about stability in certain parts of the world. And so what I argue is, if we're serious about fighting the ideology of hate and extremism, particularly the kind of extremism that comes from groups that manipulate Islam for their nefarious ends, then we've got to get serious about Saudi Arabia. The president's trip. Sorry, go ahead.
No. I think that's so important for people to understand this, right? So it sounds like there's this manipulation of shaping a certain type of Muslim identity, especially by exploiting the young people, because they, oftentimes have identity crisis and are easier to be manipulated. And as part of that Muslim community is also, includes some kind of anti-West or anti-US. Would you go that far to say that?
Well, it's interesting. We have to really understand this, right? One, the US government is not going forward deciding what is a true Muslim and what is not a true Muslim. We have no opinion on which shape and form of respect someone has for their faith, whether it's Christian, Jewish, Hindu, Muslim. That's not what we do as government. But if we know that there are ideologies that promote violence in the name of something, that we have a problem here. We see in the textbooks that Saudi Arabia teaches their young, and also gives those textbooks around the world. These are textbooks, by the way, that ISIS used when they began the so-called caliphate, because the textbooks so aligned with their violent ideology that they used Saudi textbooks in the beginning. It isn't just about what's a pure Muslim according to what their ideology is. It's also how they feel about other faiths. So I remember, when I was special representative to Muslim communities, going into bookstores in Britain and picking up off the shelf free books that had been brought from Saudi Arabia that explained that, quote, all Jews are pigs. When you begin to teach children and young adults about an us versus them, and link it, importantly, to the way in which they practice their faith, you see what happens along the way as they're forming what they believe to be a true expression of their faith. So I know, it's not just my own travels around the world. In government, we have tons of evidence from all kinds of, organizations and researchers and academia that have looked at textbooks, that have looked at the translation of the Quran, that have spent time trying to unpack what Saudi Arabia says in terms of its reforming itself, its changing things, and what really has taken place. I think this is a really important issue, but it is not the only component to the relationship the United States has with the kingdom. And I think what I was saying about the president's trip to Saudi Arabia, as controversial as it was, because let's be clear, what the US government has found to be true about the killing of the journalist Khashoggi was that MBS was responsible for that. It was a brutal, horrific killing. And for many, including the president when he was running for office, talked about the evidence that pointed to that direction. His decision to make them, quote, a pariah. He made all that clear in the lead up to his election. What we have to understand today, too, is that while we are looking at the Middle East and we're looking at the changes and the nuances that are taking place there and the rise of various other threats that we hadn't thought about, I think the play that the president and the administration is making today is an attempt to recalibrate the relationships in the Middle East, not just for the short term, but for the longer term. And I think the controversy is when can or should the president have gone about this recalibration in this way without the kind of responsibility that they believe MBS should take over the killing of the journalist, and that it's so went against our values as a country and what we stand for, that if we are giving him a break on that, anything goes. And I think that's the controversy here in the United States and the way in which we've looked at it. And I think it's important that we've had those conversations. The administration made a decision to continue, obviously, to go forward and to do that. And I think the consequences of that first step can't be seen in the weeks after the visit. It will be evidenced in the way in which a relationship changes over time.
Yeah, I think, what you said about just a lot of short-term, long-term kind of strategy or policies that oftentimes the US puts out have significant consequences, right? And one of the things I would say I like about, and you would certainly agree, was just the appointment of you to the position as the first ever US Special Representative to Muslim communities. You were born in Kashmir, India, and immigrated to the US at a young age, and as a Muslim. And can you just tell us, what the position was about, and why did at that time Secretary Hillary Clinton create a position like that? Perhaps, giving the historic context of 9/11 and its aftermath.
One of the important things to think about when we think about the relationship we're trying to build with 1/4 of the planet, which 1/4 of the planet is Muslim, is that the way the United States looked at those demographics, a religious demographic, we as diplomats would often engage with religious communities, not through the lens of, looking at only one religion and saying we have to build better bridges, but really bringing interfaith into our conversations and diplomacy and how we think about things. And those that live in Muslim majority countries, as well as those who live as minorities, were not necessarily part of US foreign policy equations as we lived prior to 9/11. 9/11 comes along and the whole world is actually, turned upside down, not expecting to see the kind of impact a group like Al-Qaeda could have. And importantly, their ability to recruit young ideological soldiers to their cause, which obviously is not just a US threat, it's a threat for communities all over the world. So the decision in the Bush administration was to say, we are looking at this problem that we have, this challenge. Al-Qaeda is ascendant. We have just been attacked. We've got to go after them. And there was a dimension of this reaction. Obviously, that was a hard power component. The military, go after him, break down the cells, go after the money. But then there was also a conversation about the ideology. Who's being recruited? How are they being recruited? What is appealing to these young people that they find this ideology of interest? How can we think differently about this? How can we build better connections with communities that we know Al-Qaeda is going after? And so those kinds of conversations were happening not just in the United States, but obviously in other parts of the world too. We want to fortify, we want to inoculate communities so that AQ could not come in and lure young people in. And one of the ways we did that was to what in the Bush administration was called the war of ideas, the ideological component of the fight. Can we build antibodies using local communities, listening to their ideas on how to fortify themselves against the appeal of this ideology? And so that effort took hold in the Bush administration, and we piloted the approach through work that I did in the Europe Bureau of the State Department, trying to see, could we think about building networks of like-minded thinkers? Could we?
And why did we start in Europe?
We started in Europe because of something that had happened that people will remember. In 2006, there was the Danish cartoon crisis that happened. People were freaked. I mean, today it's odd because, it's 2022. We know what a viral moment is. We know that something that happens in one part of the world can affect something in something else. At that time, Twitter was not Twitter. It didn't exist. 2006 was a very different time. So suddenly a cartoon that mocked it was a satirical cartoon about the Prophet Muhammad,
Yes.
that was able to generate violence in
Yes.
other parts of the world, where US embassies and Western embassies had to protect themselves because there was violence that was happening. People lost their lives because of this cartoon and the violence that came afterwards. But importantly, you're asking, like, so how and what did we do? We said, there's a lot we don't know. How could something that happened in Copenhagen affect a life in Kabul? What is happening in Europe? And the traditional thinking for foreign policy is all things Muslim, Islam is from the Middle East. Like that's the mentality. In fact, there are more Muslims that live outside of the Middle East than in it. We had not done the kind of nuanced thinking around the complexity of demographics with Muslims around the world to understand what was taking place. Certainly in Europe, it was a new moment for us to be thinking about what's actually happening with a fourth generation Muslim Brit. What's happening with a second generation Turkish German? How do they think about identity and belonging? And if we don't understand what's happening, and Al-Qaeda does, we have a problem, because Al-Qaeda's narratives that are going after specific communities around being a real Muslim, they're going to beat us, and they're going to get more recruits because they're playing a different kind of game. So we started in Europe because of the conversation that happened within the US government after the Danish cartoon crisis. We piloted programs in the Europe Bureau over the course of 2 years, 2007 to 2009, where we stood up networks of like-minded thinkers. We generated all kinds of new thinking that, in fact, the European governments were not doing. We got to know different kinds of communities, and we understood the grassroots was really, really important, and that we needed to help seed many different kinds of programs to build fortification. When President Obama, sorry, go ahead.
Continue.
I was just going to say, so we had that model. And when President Obama became president, he was, and he very historically in his inauguration speech on the steps of the Capitol talked about wanting to build a new kind of relationship with Muslims around the world based on mutual interest and mutual respect. It was an important priority for the administration. How can we think differently about 1/4 of the planet? And one of the ways in which we were thinking about that is building new kinds of connections. And when I briefed Secretary Clinton about the work that we had done in the Bush administration about building, new bridges, finding new ways to connect with communities, she said, "This is a great model. Can we take what we did in Europe and do it globally?" And so she created the Office of the Special Representative to Muslim Communities. I was very fortunate to be asked to serve my nation in that capacity. And we built a plan of action around getting to know civil society, getting to know different kinds of elements in communities around the world, finding new ways to find common interest, to develop networks that had never existed before. And that's the work that we did in the Obama administration through the Office of the Special Representative.
Yeah, I think those intentions were really important for people to know, because, for the rest of the world, if they just look at U.S. government actions, usually, it's manifested in our military powers, I would say our military presence around the world, right? So it's hard power, but there's a lot of work that actually goes into, trying to understand the communities and trying to win the hearts and minds of, the people around the world. Unfortunately, I would say that kind of work, I want you to talk more about that, which is, it's not well understood, and it's also not well executed, and it doesn't have enough resources behind it. And that's kind of your criticism of the U.S. government, sort of failures over the years of whether it's understanding sort of the Muslim communities or, just inside the government, not investing enough in people who actually have the on the ground experiences, or people who can simply relate to a different kind of, whether it's religious groups or ethnic groups or countries or cultures. And so you kind of call for a whole of society approach to really try to win the hearts and minds of Muslim communities. And how do you feel about it? Is that feasible right now, just given, the perception of the US around the world?
One of the components to the question you're asking is this moment that we're in today with so much crisis around us. It's not just wars, it is instability around even the security of our own country. When we began this work, we were not looking at a threat within the United States from neo-Nazis the way we are today. We were not so the different kinds of extremism that are ascendant are very scary, very real, and very serious. And we have to understand that when the US government, which is only one part of the solution set, right? Government can do one piece of things. But what I call for in the book is for people to understand that there is a change that is happening culturally around the world, around us versus them, whether it has to do with religion or race or gender or sexuality, pick your thing. That we have increased the distance between communities, and it's become dangerous in terms of stability and sort of cohesion for work that we need to do on anything. If you can't talk to somebody who's different than you, we have a problem. So that's one piece of it. The other is, a lot has changed since 9/11 in 20 years in the way in which our government has talked about Muslim communities. And this is not, I want to be clear, this is not just about Muslim communities, because one could say to, look at what is happening with what neo-Nazis have done in our country and the changes that are happening in a very short period of time around the rise of hate. And what we need to do is to have everybody be aware that this isn't something that we can just sort of put aside. We have to stop being lazy on hate. And we need to get serious about what you need to do to change society so that it is not cool. It is not all right. It is not permissible. People don't just yeah, you can hate somebody. It's all right. We've got to change the culture in which we're doing that. I really believe very strongly that millennials, Gen Z, and Gen Alpha are the communities that we need to go after and help them to think about a conscious way of living so that they're not being duped by nefarious agents that want them to move in a different direction around identity and belonging. That's going to mean that businesses need to think differently about the way in which they're activating at a community level. What can they be doing to fight hate and extremism? And anti-Semitism is on the rise, and anti-Asian hate is on the rise, and we could go on and on. So it's not just about sort of the Muslim thing. It is much bigger than that. Secondly, I'm sorry to say, I will say this because philanthropy is an important part of the conversation too. I don't believe the philanthropic sector has stood up on this issue the way they could. And they need to get serious because the players that are able to invest in local solutions are not government entities. They're NGOs that do this work. And NGOs need the support funding-wise, obviously, of different kinds of funding streams, including philanthropy.
Yeah, one thing you said that was really interesting in terms of the neo-Nazism in the United States in recent years. So, I think a lot of people in Taiwan kind of appreciated Trump administration's strong support for Taiwan, but how he talked about the COVID virus and also, his very hawkish China policy, almost in some ways blindly, is also viewed as contributing to the rising anti-Asian hate sentiment in the United States. And so what we're definitely seeing, whether it's the Muslim communities or the anti-Asian hate phenomena, sort of the narrative and actions taken by the government towards a country, a religion, a region, or a government really shape people's perception, right? That's why, whether it's the U.S. war on terror or, sort of the war in Afghanistan or Iraq, was often interpreted as U.S. against Islam or the Muslim communities. And it's really, really difficult to be nuanced. So what's your take on that, and how can we do better?
We have evidence, very clear evidence, that words that come out of a president's mouth actually impact the way society accepts and appreciates a particular issue. And we know that. One of the things I will say, and I said this consistently when I was in government, if you do the homework and you do the research and you understand what did American presidents have to say about Islam and Muslims from the very beginning, you can look at every single one of our presidents, starting with George Washington, all the way to Barack Obama. Every single president used their stature to speak with respect about the religion of Islam and Muslims, and the importance of diversity of different faiths in our country, the ability for people to practice their faith in our country. So the optics and the language and the stature of the president's words, whether it was Reagan or whether it was Obama, said what we know to be true about our country and how we think about the diversity of our nation. When you have a president that goes in the opposite direction, in fact, President Trump did quite the opposite, calling very fine people after the Charlottesville, horrific attack by neo-Nazis and the woman who lost her life, Heather Heyer. Whether you hear the president in the Oval talking about, people who are not white in a particular way, whether he decides to be funny, and I use that in quotes, about the Kung flu, whether all of the nasty, horrible things that President Trump did in the language and in the tone and the aggression in which he talked about it, lit up his followers in a very different way. And it sent a ripple, not just through our country, but around the world, that the US president is looking at these issues, speaking about these communities in a particular way. So I know that his language fueled those who are interested in separating and building an us versus them. We know through the evidence of what happened in our nation about anti-Asian hate, the rise of incidents in our nation against people who are, we use the term AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander is the term that's used in the United States for a whole group of very diverse people, unfortunately. But the rise of hate, violent attack, we know this to be true. So we have to be really clear about US policies are not policies necessarily that are, our relationship with India is not a relationship with a Judeo-Christian nation, with a Hindu majority nation. That's not the way we do foreign policy. But we've got to be clear about the values that we have and the way in which we speak about different communities. And President Trump, I'm sorry to say, just did not do that.
I mean, I think both of us would agree on that. And it's interesting because his China stance was quite welcomed in other parts of the world. So I want to talk about China because you also visited Muslim community in China, the Hui people, and also other parts of Asia. And you did not visit Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Did you actually try when you were in the government?
When I was special representative, I was invited by the Asia Society to be on a panel in China and got a visa to be able to do that. And we added a few other stops on that trip. We were not able to go see the Uyghurs. And that was I was very sorry not to be able to do that because obviously China is a very ancient country filled with communities of Muslims, by the way, that have been around for a long time. The Uyghurs are some, the Hui people are others. And I was able to visit mosques that were, more than 1,000 years old. I was able to talk to academics about the diversity of Islam in China and where and how, these communities were built. I also had some really interesting conversations with non-Muslim Chinese around the feeling of Islam in China and what had changed after 9/11. I remember, having conversations with people talking about the pride that they had because of some of these communities that were very old and very valued communities, but that they perceived the Islam component as threatening now at a time when they never had before because of incidents that were happening around the world, the way they were hearing about what real Islam was supposed to be, a violence, and there was fear that was injected into the conversation. So that was interesting for me, but was also very interesting for me to know that at the same time that, you can have these conversations around ancient communities in China that were Muslim, one of the most important ones I was not able to visit. And we know today the impact of that fear and that aggression on the Uyghurs. And I will say, you've heard the statements from Secretary Blinken. He recently talked about this, the joint statement with the Canadians and the Brits about what's happening in Xinjiang and what we know to be true through Chinese documents themselves, through satellites, through firsthand witnesses. The camps, 1 to 2 million that are in these vocational camps. We know about forced labor. We know about the sterilization. We know about the eradication of history. We know about the detentions. We know that too, which is also very interesting. We know that there are Muslim majority nations like Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Morocco and others who are helping the Chinese round up people with that ethnic background to bring them back to China. And so there is a lot going on around the issue of Uyghurs, not just in China, but globally. How the world responds to this and the values that we have around human rights, around what we know is happening is going to be, I think, continue to be, a very important conversation that we have. I want to link it also to what we know to be true about consumers, because what you're seeing happen in the United States and in other parts of the world is the linkage between where you get your cotton, the supply chain component of forced labor. And it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out.
Yeah, I want to really drill down on this a little bit more, because I think, sort of Uyghurs as forced labor issues, or, being forced to relinquish their religion and their languages and their culture and traditions actually has been going on in China for a long time, right? It's documented from 10, 15 years ago. But it didn't get a lot of attention in the US government. And there was criticism back then that the US government wasn't giving China enough pressure because, the US was engaged in the so-called war on terror. And the Chinese government excuse has always been, oh, these are extremists. They are, people who basically stir up violence in the country. And I still remember some, incidents that, seem to align with their narrative, framing those people as terrorists, and therefore they needed to take hard actions against some of the people. And of course, fast forward, what we're seeing is, I'm not saying which side is right, but, just more hatred and more harsh crackdown on this community. What do you think, I would say, in terms of the US, actions and words and policies towards on one hand, it's war on terror. On the other hand, it is, about another religious ethnic minority in China. How does the US really balance the two?
We have been, I will say, very clear for a long time. It is not a new issue. When you look at DRL, the Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, part of the State Department, you look at the reports that we give out every year around human rights and what country reports, the issue of the Uyghurs is not new. This is not something that suddenly came to pass. We have watched lots of action over the course of the 20 years since 9/11, where countries are picking out minority groups and using the excuse of terrorism to round them up and do horrific things. So this brand of spin isn't new. But what is new is today. There's a combination of both what policy people and intel folks know about what's happening in China and what has been happening in China, and the pace with which they're doing things, alongside with media being suddenly interested in this issue. So I want to be clear that as long as I can think about the way in which we've looked at minority groups in other countries, specifically, this issue of the Uyghurs, this isn't like, this came up 5 years ago and suddenly we're interested in it. This has been going on for a long time. The question is, why has it taken so long? If you look at Amnesty International, if you look at the National Endowment for Democracy, if you look at any of these, reputable organizations, they have been talking about this issue for a long time. So what's changed? What's changed that media is deciding, journalists are reporting that there are new facts. There's a lot of change that's happened in the ecosystem that is allowing this conversation to take place. And I think it is, I don't want to be cute about why it happened, but there are forces that are pushing this issue, thankfully, forward so that people can see what's been happening and the horror that is taking place for this ethnic minority.
Well, thank you, FARAH. I think today has been so educational to myself and a lot of our audience. I wish your book is translated into Chinese and, being available in Taiwan, and we can discuss that later. But it's a great book for our global audience. And thank you for taking the time to speak to us. And I wish you the best and take care.
Thank you.